Hey there, my name is Alex, I am the Silvermont, and this is my review of God of War 2018, or God of War 4, whatever you want to call it. And I'll start this review off with a quick disclaimer. I purchased the digital deluxe version of the game with my own money, and this is not a sponsored review. I have never played any of the other God of War games, but I have watched most of them on YouTube. I played through God of War 2018 on the standard difficulty setting, and I did the majority of the game's content. That is to say, I haven't gathered every collectible, but I fought every boss, every enemy, and done every quest. I'll grab the few remaining collectibles and platinum the game in a bit, but for now, I feel I'm able to fairly review the game, so let's kick it off. And I think it's important to begin this review by addressing a few of the most frequent concerns I've seen online, as I'm sure they'll get brought up in the comments. And indeed one of them is one I had myself. This doesn't look like God of War. The franchise started in something like 2005 and was famous for huge boss battles, quick time events, and fast-paced action. You could say that the original God of War followed the trend set by Devil May Cry, and Kratos was a very angry individual who would murder anything that got in his path, even a hapless civilian. Yet now, the game's camera is much closer to the action, the gameplay is less frenetic, and Kratos has mellowed out quite a bit. You won't be using slaves to hold up gates only for their bodies to be crushed to pieces in this game. There's no mini-games where Kratos humps ladies. So if you're a really big fan of the past God of War games and wanted more of the same, you might be disappointed. Incidentally, there's no multiplayer here, and so far as I'm aware there's no New Game Plus option either, but you can keep playing after the end of the game. A post-game, shall we say. Whereas the previous God of War games were following a trend, this new soft reboot is more setting the trends, if you ask me. Another common complaint people will raise is that it's The Last of Us reskinned, because it's a third-person game with lots of walking around and cutscenes, and you have a kid with you. So there's some merit to those arguments, but fundamentally they are only surface-level similarities, in the same way that Killzone is like Call of Duty because you both have guns and shoot Nazis now and then. Regarding the premise of God of War though, after the events of God of War 3, we find Kratos in a very different environment to what we're used to from the franchise, with a wife that has recently passed, leaving Kratos alone with his son, Atreus. Together, father and son embark on a journey to scatter her ashes from the highest mountain in all the realms. Throughout the journey, Kratos will struggle with being a parent, struggle with the anger that still roils within him, and struggle with understanding this strange new land. Atreus, on the other hand, will go through the sorts of problems you would expect a kid to go through. The relationship between father and son is the crux of this story. Quite a personal one, although naturally you can expect them to get wrapped up in interesting and godly affairs. Well, how about the gameplay then? It's a hard game to define, hence why I call it a trendsetter. Maybe the easiest way to describe it would be The Last of Us meets Bloodborne with a dash of For Honor. The game's world is what I would define as semi-open, in that you have a large 3D space to explore, but it is largely handcrafted instead of being generic open fields and huge open spaces. The best comparison would be with Dark Souls or Bloodborne with a dash of Metroid. Areas are full of shortcuts that loop back around, hidden chambers, and generally the world itself is quite small, but feels richly detailed. You go from the top of a mountain to a huge lake, and realistically you got there way too soon, just like how in Dark Souls you can go from Ash Lake to Anor Londo in the matter of a few minutes of walking. But it feels natural when you're playing it. The world is small but feels large because it's richly detailed, just like Lordran and Yharnam. As for Metroid, well, there are plenty of areas and paths you can't access. You might find something blocking your path and you'll be like, I know I'll be able to move this, I just don't have the tools for it right now. So you keep them in mind and go back there later. There is a fast travel system in the game, which is unlocked in stages. A few hours into the game you will unlock the ability to fast travel back to a sort of central hub area, you could say. And then a bit later into the game, maybe, I don't know, halfway, 3/4 of the way through, you unlock the ability to fast travel to any fast travel point you've unlocked. The combat though, well, there's a bit of For Honor and a bit of Dark Souls. The behind the shoulder action and speed of the combat is roughly equivalent to For Honor, but the flow of combat has definitely taken some cues from Bloodborne in my opinion. There's no stamina system, and Kratos is outfitted with very few weapons, but they are all versatile and effective. The big new thing here is the Leviathan Axe, a frost-imbued weapon that can be thrown and recalled like Thor's famous Mjolnir hammer. You have light and heavy attacks, which can be used to combo and launch enemies, and as you play through the game you'll get experience which you can use to unlock new skills, new attacks, and so forth. You also have your fists, and you might be thinking, what good are fists? Why would you punch enemies when you have an axe? Well, they do a lot more damage than you might think, and when you attack enemies, you build up a stun meter on them. When this stun meter is full, it allows you to perform a finishing move or grapple on an enemy. And as it happens, fist weapons deal more stun damage than the axe does. You could say your fists do blunt damage, which is more for stunning, whereas the axe is slashing damage. You also have a shield that you can block with, and if you block just before an enemy hits you, you do a parry, which has quite generous timing, so it's a really good thing to get used to. You can also use your shield as a weapon to bash enemies with. It's kind of combined with your fist weapons. When you're punching enemies, you'll also smack them with your shield. You can also unlock more abilities for the shield, such as bouncing back projectiles. There is a very satisfying flow to the combat in God of War. You can throw your axe, pin an enemy to a tree or freeze them in place, then beat on another with your fists, before calling your axe back to your hand mid-air for a powerful finisher. On top of this, you also have runic attacks, which are essentially special attacks you can add to your weapon, one for light, one for heavy. These operate on a cooldown, and there's quite a lot of them, and they're all really flashy and spectacular. Now, the combat in this particular video is all from the very start of the game, so I don't really have any skills unlocked, because whilst I really wanted to show off later in the game or end game combat, it's almost impossible to do that without spoiling things, and that is something I struggled with a lot in this review. See, the start of the game in particular is very slow paced, as you're probably seeing. It's a lot of walking around, cinematic stuff. And whilst the game overall is quite cinematic, later on the combat gets really fun. But again, I can't show the better combat, I can't show a lot of the really appealing things about the game because it would be spoiling the game, you know? And of course, as for combat, there's also Atreus. Hitting square will cause Atreus to shoot your target. Later on you get a special attack where you hold square. And his arrows, well, they take a short moment to replenish, but they have useful effects like distracting or stunning enemies. He will also sometimes grab enemies or trip them for you, and for the most part he's invincible, so you never need to worry about babysitting him. He will be grabbed by enemies sometimes, but all this means is that he can't shoot them for a bit whilst he's recovering. By and large, you don't need to worry about babysitting Atreus. The only issue throughout the whole game I ever had with him was on one specific point I needed him to examine some runes, but he had gone on ahead through a corridor and he wouldn't come back because getting him through the corridor required me to be there, so I was a bit stuck. All this meant is that I had to reload a checkpoint, which means I lost about 30 seconds of progress. That's the only glitch I experienced in my time playing the game. It's also worth pointing out, they patched this game like every day that I was playing it, so they were really working on ironing out bugs, but reassuringly I only ever encountered that one bug. As for Atreus being invincible, I may or may not have used him to tank some tougher enemies now and then with his invincible face. Overall, I really enjoyed the combat in God of War. It was not super skill based, but it made you feel quite powerful. Maybe not as powerful as the old God of War games, because Kratos isn't quite as brutal, although he still does have brutal finishes, I should point out. I've seen people saying that the combat's really mellow and PG-13 now, which is not true at all. You can rip the jaws off enemies, you can rip them in half by the torso. It's still very violent, just maybe not quite as violent as it used to be, because, again, part of the story is that Kratos is actively fighting with this rage within him. The combat isn't as skill-based or as hard as like Ninja Gaiden or something like that, but it's good, it's fun, and it feels satisfying to me, but that's of course a very subjective point. My largest complaints would be the level system that the game uses and the enemy variety. Armor and items that you equip in God of War have a power level, and the higher your weighted average, the higher your level. I suppose you could roughly compare it with the light system in Destiny, or item level in many MMOs. If all your gear is roughly level 5, then your level will probably also be around 5. If you're level 2 and fighting a level 7 or 8 enemy, they will do obscene amounts of damage to you, and most of their attacks will be unblockable. I'm not a huge fan of this system, but I can understand its implementation. Let me explain why I don't really like it though. Fighting a level 8 Revenant when I'm level 2 was essentially impossible, and yet when I returned at level 8, it was so easy I could have done it with my eyes closed. My skill as a player did not necessarily improve a great deal, it was purely a stats driven thing, which I don't really like, but again, it's not a deal breaker, and that was my cap. Enemy variety is an interesting one. If we're talking standard enemies, that's been a complaint some people had, but for the most part I was happy with the variety. But when we're talking about bosses, that's a little harder to get into, not least because of spoilers, which in general ties into an overall feeling I had with the game. But without going into much detail, I found the boss variety a little disappointing in the new God of War, in particular because 2 bosses are reskinned and reused what felt like a dozen times each, to the point where they weren't really bosses anymore, just regular enemies with a special health bar. I would have loved to see more of the large-scale boss encounters. See, the series is known, it's famous for really over-the-top, exciting boss battles, and I was worried about God of War not having those, but then not long into the game, maybe half an hour into the game, you get a really cool boss battle, but then after that, you go the majority of the game without anything like that for a long time. They are there, they are spread sparsely throughout the game, and maybe that's good because you don't want to overindulge on them, but at the same time, I really wanted more of them. If they make a sequel to this game, which I'm positive is on the cards judging from how well it's selling, I'd like to see more of that. More bosses, more unique bosses, more exciting bosses. I would also like to see a bit more weapon variety. Now, you know I love spears, Kratos is a Spartan, so give him a spear in the sequel please. God no. How about graphics and presentation? Well damn. God of War might be one of the best looking games I've ever played. The world is absolutely beautiful on a technical and artistic level. The texture work, the materials, it is a breathtakingly gorgeous game. YouTube videos just can't do it justice. Sadly, neither can the PS4, not even the PS4 Pro. Whilst the game looks absolutely amazing, performance is something else entirely. I was playing on the PS4 Pro, which has 2 modes available, resolution and performance. Resolution gives you a simulated 4K and a 30 FPS cap. Performance gives you 1080p and uncapped frame rate. I went with the latter. Most of this video is the performance mode, by the way. Now, even though I don't like inconsistent frame rates, this is an action game, so 60 FPS is what we want, and it's definitely what I want. But you can't get a locked or consistent 60 FPS. Unfortunately, the frame rate in performance mode is all over the place. In resolution mode, it's mostly 30 FPS and fairly stable. If this game was on PC, where we could get a locked 60 FPS and, you know, even higher level of visual fidelity, it would be the best looking game on the market right now. There's nothing that looks better than this in my opinion. The only real issue I can bring up with the game's visuals are that there are two entities in the world who have kind of blurry, low-res textures, but those are things that, well, how should I put it? They are things that are usually miles away, but at very brief points in the game you can get really close to them, and you can see that the textures look ugly. The other visual issue I had is that sometimes light shafts, or volumetric fog, whatever you want to call it, looks kind of blocky or low res. Like you can make out shapes in the fog instead of it being smooth. Those are two very minor nitpicks though, and this is a really weird complaint I've seen online. People are saying like, they're calling it Fog of War, God of Fog, that there's just fog everywhere, which that's not true at all, unless they're thinking of a very brief point in the game where it gets foggy because there's something hiding in the fog. Overall, the presentation is great. As has been brought up by many other people, the entire game is one long take. There are no cuts, no load times unless you die. Everything is presented in one single camera shot, so to speak, and yes, that includes fast travel too. From start to end, from when you press new game to the credits, it's all one take. That's an intriguing concept that I don't think I've ever seen in a game before. It helps you feel closer to Kratos and Atreus, as you're always seeing things from their perspective. It never, like, cuts to something on the other side of the world. And although you are mostly controlling Kratos, you are technically playing both father and son, which is another thing I like. The game is full of nice small touches too. For example, when you're boating around, and a lot of the game's travel is done by a boat, you boat from one area to another, the characters will engage in banter or small talk, but let's say you reach your destination and you want to dock. In a lot of games, the conversation will just cut off and be lost to you. In God of War, the characters will say something like, "But let's pick this up later," or "Save that story for the boat," you know? And then next time you get in the boat, they'll say, "So earlier you were telling me about this thing," or something, or "Where was I?" and they'll continue where they left off. That's a really natural way of doing it, and it's a small detail, but I really enjoy it because I can't even imagine how many games I've been like listening to an audio log or something, for example, and then I stop and I stand still because I don't want something to interrupt it and mean that I lose it and have to replay it in a menu or something, you know? So it's a small touch, but it's a really welcome one, and the game's full of things like that. Finally, the cast of characters, and this will tie in nicely to an overall point I have, is colourful and appealing in their nature, but it's a small one. Whilst the game doesn't have a huge cast, they are entertaining in their own ways for the most part, and I thought the performances were fine. Some of the American accents were a little bit jarring, but I've seen very conflicting opinions here. Some people hate the voice acting, some people love it. I do think it's a little odd they've replaced the guy who voiced Kratos in every other game, but whatever. And the new Kratos does a fine job, I think. And yet, if you know anything about the setting and mythology that this game takes place in, you might be frustrated. God of War is a long game, but it feels like a prequel, an introduction. That isn't to say the story or game feels sparse or short or that it cuts off early. You achieve your goal that you set out to do. But there are so many characters and elements in this setting that I want to see, but they aren't present. It feels like they're being saved for a sequel. You could say they don't want to blow their whole load at once. In conclusion, God of War is a great game, but it does feel a bit like a precursor, a prequel to something more. Like everything throughout the game, even though it's a long game, it's a content-rich game, it all feels like it's setting up for something more. I don't know exactly how long the game was, but it was long. The pacing was good, if a little comical at times, because every time you think you're at your goal, something pops up and prevents you from reaching it. Almost to the point of it becoming an in-joke. The graphics are great, the performance is passable, and the combat's really fun. I had a good time, like never using my axe, as if only worthy enemies got to meet my axe. I would punch the crap out of everything, and then if something really tough showed up, yeah, maybe I would bring the Leviathan axe out. And that sort of combat I love, where you can just completely overpower the enemies and you feel like you are the one in complete control. There's a good number of side activities for you to engage in too, most of which were good. The side quests, for example, they didn't feel tacked on, they weren't go grab my vegetables. They felt like they were enriching the experience, telling you more about the world even though it wasn't something crucial to the story. It was delivered in a way that I felt was organic, and it didn't fall into the trap a lot of games have where it's like, the end of the world is happening, but hang on, I have to go and do this pointless side quest, you know? It felt very organic in that there are reasons why you would be doing these side quests, why you would be exploring. Your end goal in the game is not a really crucial one, and when crucial or important things do happen, they keep you from side quests for a short amount of time. The soundtrack didn't stand out to me, but it wasn't bad, and unless I missed it, we never had the, like, thing that I think of as the God of War theme. I don't know what it's called, but you know, it's like there was dun 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 dun. I don't know what that track's called. I have to go look it up now. It's probably called something like Rage of Kratos or something. And honestly, this might be my game of the year, but let's wait and see. For now, the year is still quite young, but so far, this is my game of the year. And for people who are worrying about it being too cinematic, too full of quick time events, I really wouldn't worry about that. Yes, there are a lot of moments with scripted parts, but there's also a lot of gameplay. Oh, there's also puzzles in the game too, but I don't really know what to say about them. I solved them all, but I'm really bad at puzzles, so I think the game did a good job of making the puzzles simple, but also making you feel kind of smart when you solve them. And I know there's people wondering, where's the replay value because there's no multiplayer? Well, I can get 40 to 50 hours of content out of the game. That works for me. I don't need replay value, you know? If the game is really solid and gives me a great experience, then yeah. A lot of the problem I have with cinematic games is that they tend to be like 5 or 6 hours long. So at that point, yeah, I do want replay value. In this case though, you get the best of both worlds. In the future, I want to see more of the mythological elements. I want to see more weapons. I don't expect a huge weapon pool, but maybe something like 3 to 5 would be good. And this is very specific to me, but I would love to see co-op, seeing as the entire game is more or less single-player co-op anyway. I don't see why not. Or even just a DLC. I think it would really be great in this game, but you know, that's very specific to me. I just love co-op games, okay? And there aren't enough games that do it in a semi-open world like this. That's one of the reasons I really love Dark Souls and Bloodborne, but they don't really tie the co-op in that game into the exploration. It's more just for the combat and the bosses, which is fine, but what I really enjoy in a game is co-op exploration as well as combat. And I would love to see that in a game. But you know, that's about it. Do you have a PS4? Then I think you should definitely pick up God of War, as it's a great game. Don't have a PS4? Maybe now is the time to pick one up, as you'll have a whopping 2 games to play with God of War and Bloodborne. I kid. Mostly. But I hope this review was useful or entertaining, and if there's any questions I didn't answer, feel free to ask down below and I'll get back to you ASAP. Until next time though, take care, have fun. God of War 2018 has a really hearty recommendation from me. Ciao.
Fine. My turn.